Good morning, everybody from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and good afternoon and good evening to those who are connecting from around the world. Thank you very much for connecting to the Sustainable and Inclusive Finance Forum. We'll be starting in just 2 minutes, and before that, we wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. Just to note that all of the attendees will be muted throughout the session. To ask a question to a panelist, please send it through the question and answer function to host and panelists. And for general communications, please do post to the chat function. At the conclusion of the session, every session this week, we'll also be doing a poll soliciting feedback. So please do share any thoughts that you have, because that is the best way for us to improve programming in the future. Soon we'll be hearing from our keynote speakers and then a presentation and panel on green taxonomy. But for now, let me turn this over to Dr. Firaz Rad, Country Manager of the Malaysia Sustainable Inclusive Growth Hub. Thank you.
Thank you, Rekha. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, good morning from Kuala Lumpur, and good afternoon and good evening to those connected from around the world. My name is Firaz Rad, and as Country Manager for the World Bank's Inclusive Growth and Sustainable Finance Hub in Malaysia, I would like to welcome you all today to the opening session of our Sustainable and Inclusive Finance Forum. This global event is co-organized by Bank Negara Malaysia and the World Bank Group in close collaboration with other government institutions and development partners, including the Malaysian Ministry of Finance, the Securities Commission Malaysia, and the Islamic Financial Services Board. I'm also happy to share with you that we have over 2,200 people registered for this forum, from not only Asia, but also from Africa, Europe, the Middle East, North America, and South America. We are thrilled by the level of this global participation and by the keen interest shown in the important development topics of sustainable finance and inclusive finance. During this forum, we will cover a wide range of issues. Today, we will learn about global experiences in implementing green taxonomies, and about the progress achieved by countries in using the Green Sukuk instrument. Tomorrow will feature a discussion on Islamic finance and how it is being leveraged to promote financial inclusion, as well as the start of a 2-day Green Finance Leadership Program, an activity that we are hosting with Tsinghua University together with the UK Partnership for Climate Transition, PACT, and the UN Environment Financial Centers for Sustainability, FC4S. I would also like to extend the greetings of World Bank Country Director for Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand, Indiame Diop, who will be one of our keynote speakers in a session tomorrow afternoon as part of the Green Finance Leadership Program. On Thursday, we will examine the evolution of the Malaysian money service business sector and how it has improved financial inclusion outcomes. The forum will conclude on Friday with a panel analyzing the development of Malaysia's domestic bond market. For our opening session today, we are delighted that Governor Datuk Nur Shamsi of Bank Negara Malaysia and World Bank Vice President for the East Asia and Pacific region, Victoria Kwakwa, will be joining us. Due to changes in scheduling commitments, both the Governor and Vice President Victoria will be participating via pre-recorded remarks. I will now leave you with their prepared remarks that mark the official opening of our Sustainable and Inclusive Finance Forum. So please excuse us, the video will be playing momentarily. So we apologize for this delay. So thank you, Vice President Victoria Kwakwa and Governor Datuk Noor Shamsiya for these insightful remarks. And let me express again our appreciation to Bank Negara Malaysia for co-hosting this event and for its close collaboration in advancing many of the agendas that will be featured in this forum over the next 3 days. Before moving on, I'd like to ask everyone who has been connected via YouTube to switch over to WebEx because of some technical difficulties that we've been experiencing with YouTube. With the conclusion of these opening and keynote remarks, we will now move to our first session on classifying green, developing a national green taxonomy. At this time, I will pass the virtual floor to my colleague Farah Imrana Hussein. Farah is a senior official officer at the World Bank Treasury based in Washington, D.C. She specializes in providing technical assistance to countries in areas related to the development of green bond markets. Farah will be presenting on this topic and will be joined later in a fireside chat by Egul Kusalayeva, Director of Green Finance Intelligence at the AIFC Green Finance Center in Kazakhstan, and Arslan Oz Ahmad, CEO of HSBC Amana Malaysia. And with that, Farah, I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Firas. Good morning, everyone. First of all, let me thank Bank Negara Malaysia and our World Bank Group Sustainable Finance Hub for inviting me specifically to participate in this forum. I'm really delighted to be here. And of course, very, very happy to be able to present to you this guide on how to develop a national green taxonomy for emerging market regulators. We actually started this work when we were engaged with Bank Negara Malaysia to help them develop their taxonomy. And the recommendations that are given in this guide are informed by our experiences from that work, as well as our experiences of similar initiatives in other countries, like in Colombia, in any further, I guess we should talk. Slide 1.
Farah, do you want to continue? We do see you and we do hear you.
Yes, sure. So, as I mentioned, it's important to talk about definitions because, the word taxonomy itself seems very, very scientific. And, if you're anything like me, a financial specialist, you have probably not heard of the term green taxonomy, at least not until the European Commission started the work on the green taxonomy itself. The truth of the matter is that there were countries even before the European Commission who were working on developing these definitions for green products. As in 2020. They did not call them specifically green taxonomy. Some of Bangladesh called it a green product list. China called it green catalog, but it was basically the same thing. So can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, good, thanks. So why is a taxonomy needed? It's really needed to help banks and financial institutions and other market participants identify green assets and green investments. So it addresses the concerns about ambiguity. It provides clarity. So it helps us move from this self-defined categories towards more standardized definitions. And I think that here I should also mention the definition of people think is just about climate financing, when the idea of green financing is a much broader concept encompassing broader environmental objectives and not just climate change. And some people, of course, would like to include also even broader concepts such as the social concepts in the green taxonomy. So here in our green taxonomy, in our guide, the definition that we are using, the one that you see here on this slide, a classification of environmentally sustainable economic activities to serve as a mandatory or voluntary guideline for green financing. This is the definition that's been given by the International Capital Markets Association. And that's the one that we're following in this guide. Next slide, please. And the objective of this guide is really to provide guidelines on how financial regulators in emerging markets financial regulators who want to green the financial system. They want to track the flows of financing into specific sustainable development agendas or environmental projects, and so they want to facilitate sustainability related reporting and disclosure guidelines, and this will help them track the flow of money towards those ends, and it will also help them avoid reputational risk. It can help them support regulatory interventions when they're thinking about designing incentives, etc. For banks and financial institutions, it's very obvious if they are to originate and structure green banking products, then they need to understand what green assets are. So the green taxonomy would help them identify those assets more easily, boosting efficiency it would also allow sustainable investments. Next slide, please. And then, of course, there are the investors who need to develop different kinds of green investments and investment policies aligned with the preferences of their clients and beneficiaries. And they can do that when they understand the exposure of their portfolios to those investments. So they need first clarity about what green means. And also, it would help them disclose their exposure to that kind of investments as required by regulators. And it would support their engagement with investees with regard to transition plans and business models, etc. For green bond issuers, and not just the issuers, but for also certifiers, and bonds, and that's how they would use it. And then there are the policymakers who can use the taxonomy to identify the areas of underinvestment and then try to bridge that funding gap and try to sort of design and develop policies that will help them close those gaps. Next slide, please. So obviously, designing a green taxonomy requires a lot of planning and a lot of thinking through. So the four areas that we feel it's very important that taxonomy developers think about prior to developing a taxonomy are these. One is the priority environmental objectives. So which environmental objectives should be used to organize the taxonomy? What are the priority environmental objectives that they would consider? What would be the scope of the tax? Would it have criteria on heat risk as in cross environmental risk, or risk transferring from the environment to the social, to our communities? Would this taxonomy be mandatory or would it be voluntary? And then finally, who would participate in the preparation of the taxonomy? Who would approve it and who would disseminate it? Next slide, please. So the focus on the environmental objectives, when a country is selecting those environmental objectives, the focus should always be in environmental objectives that are aligned with their sustainable development plans and their agendas, and the country's agendas, the country's policies and regulations. And the other thing to remember is that these environmental objectives should be ones in which finance can play an important role. So if you have an environmental objective where there are no role there.
Farah, if I can intervene.
Yes, please.
Farah, we're having bandwidth issues with your video. Could you possibly turn off your video and just
yes, of course.
rely on audio?
Yes, sure.
Great.
So, so as I was saying, the environmental objectives selected should be in line with the country's overall sustainable development policies and agendas. And they can be many different things. Like here, I've provided some examples of environmental objectives. They could be anything like promoting a cleaner urban environment, protecting natural resources like water, land, and forests. They could be pursuing a low carbon and climate resilient future. And these objectives, as I said, should be in accordance with existing environmental plans, policies, and regulations. And in selecting those environmental objectives, it's very important that we look for those in which finance can play a key role. Because if a country lacks a clear policy framework to reduce deforestation, then maybe it is better to focus on another environmental policy while developing the policy framework for deforestation. Next slide, please. So this is about risk mitigation, which is a very important consideration, because when we are financing environment-friendly projects, what we don't want is to introduce risk or transfer the risk to another environmental objective or to a social objective. And that's why the taxonomy should include a section describing the national frameworks for addressing this potential for transferring risk from one environmental objective to another or to different population groups. And you can see examples there. Examples of such a risk transfer mitigation tool is the do no significant harm concept that the EU has introduced. But for emerging markets, this could be whatever their national policies are for identifying and mitigating those risks. And I'm talking about risks related to the handling of solid waste, for instance, generated in wastewater treatment, or anything that may require the clearing of land and resettling residents and land expropriation. When we think about a wind turbine, we think that it's so green, but we also have to remember that these turbines require a lot of land, and that as the turbines are sort of are rolling, they can hit birds and kill a lot of birds and have an impact on biodiversity. When you have a hydropower plant, there are also significant implications on biodiversity. There are questions about land expropriation. There are questions about resettlement. So it's very, very important to consider risk identification and risk mitigation concepts when developing a taxonomy. Next slide, please. So who should participate in preparing the taxonomy? And obviously, this is a taxonomy to promote green finance. So we would want the financial regulators to participate. So the central bank, the Securities and Exchange commissions. But because this taxonomy is going to have an implication on the environmental side of things. So you want to have the environmental and other sector authorities there. So Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Energy, Ministry of Transport should be there. Obviously, you have to have financial institutions and investors and banks would be there. You also need to have industry specialists as well as other departments in the government who are dealing with the sustainable development agenda. Also the National Planning and Investment Department or ministries and the budget ministries will be participating in this work. Next slide, please. So what are the important principles that they should consider when developing a taxonomy? One is coherence. So they have to make sure that it does not contradict pre-existing definitions used in public and private investments addressing environmental issues. This is very, very important so as not to create any kind of confusion and to ensure that it is implementable and it is practical. Comparability, which provides clarity as to differences and similarities with other international frameworks. So you have to understand what those differences are with the EU taxonomy, for instance, or with other international and regional guidelines. And then phasing, you need to decide whether you want to do the whole thing at once or you want to give priority to certain sectors which are contributing to the environmental goals or who are readier to benefit from these guidelines. And finally, consultation is very, very important. Consultation with financial services providers, with market actors, with industry technical experts is very, very important to develop a robust taxonomy. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a snapshot of how you would go about developing a taxonomy. First of all, the World Bank recommends that you establish a steering committee or a working group with members from different ministries, government ministries, and then they agree on the strategic objective. Why are they developing this taxonomy? Why is it important to them? And they will sit together and identify the environmental objectives which are the most important for that specific country. And then they should be taking stock of complementary efforts within the country and also, consider the international experiences of EU, of China, of Bangladesh, of Mongolia, of Kazakhstan, of South Africa, etc. And then they would develop a plan of action. And as they're developing the plan of action, they need to engage local technical experts to prepare the draft. And then they would review the draft and undertake stakeholder consultation. So there would be a feedback period and they would incorporate the inputs and views as needed. And then they would decide on what the transition process would be. So when, after dissemination, at what point do the relevant actors start aligning themselves with the taxonomy? And finally, you would approve and launch the taxonomy. And this is not a once and done kind of project. The idea is that every few years you would go back and review and update the taxonomy because the technologies are going to change, your targets are going to change, the development context is going to change, and you would want to change or update the taxonomy based on those. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the World Bank provides technical assistance to help countries develop their taxonomies. We work with different stakeholders in countries to help them understand what is required, what the best practices are. We help them understand what the pros and cons of alternatives approaches are, and help create that working group that I mentioned. And then we contract local experts and help draft the taxonomies, and of course, facilitate the review and feedback of the process. Now, let me stop there because we have with us Egul Kuslieva, who is from the Astana Green Finance Center. Kazakhstan has developed a green taxonomy, and we would like to hear from Egul what their experience has been like.
Hi, Farah. Thank you for your question. And thank you for having me here today, although online. So going back to your question, indeed, EAFC Green Finance Center was involved in the development of Green Finance Framework for Kazakhstan since 2017, and that includes the adoption of the concept of green financial system for Kazakhstan, the concept, and also includes the development of green bond rules for our stock exchange. And there are certain milestones, including the recent issuance of first green bond in Kazakhstan. And going back to taxonomy, there were several discussions on development of green taxonomy starting last year. And early this year, there was a first draft of green taxonomy and developed. And sometimes in February, we had the first meeting of the stakeholders on discussion of the draft. And starting from that time, there were a number of consultations with representatives of industries to come up with the thresholds and with those sectors which will be included in the taxonomy. And it's also important to mention that the holder of the taxonomy, the Ministry of Environment, which will be later this year adopting it as a nationwide level. And if we go back to the taxonomy, there were like number of consultations during this year held online, and industry experts were considering those thresholds which should be included. And the main idea was alignment of the taxonomy goals with the main strategic document of the government, which is the concept of transition to a green economy. And I believe it's important for the countries such as Kazakhstan to have a certain distinction called transition and reflect those indicators in the taxonomies to support the transition of the economy to a more sustainable path, let's say, without any shocks, without any sudden shocks for the economy. So right now we have this final taxonomy draft developed, which covers 8 main sectors, including the renewable energy, including the clean transportation, energy efficiency, etc. And we expect it to be adopted on the nationwide level sometimes later this year or early next year, because there is another development coming now in Kazakhstan, where we're involved in the development of environmental code, which is the highest law in ranking here in Kazakhstan on environmental issues. And we hope that after the adoption of the environmental code, the taxonomy will be adopted as a part of the implementation of those measures included in the environmental code. So I think that's all from my side for now. And I also want to turn to Oz and ask his opinion about the implication of such a taxonomy for the private sector, especially if it's going to be a part of regulation. If you could elaborate on this, Oz.
Thank you. Ooh. Oh. Hello. Can you hear me, Igor? And see me?
Yeah.
Excellent. Good. Well, thank you very much for the question. I think that what I'm going to try and do is play the contrarian view and let us reflect on something that was hugely controversial this weekend. And that controversial thing that happened that I'd like to use as a segue into discussing taxonomy and what it means for the private sector is that very controversial thing was, yes, Liverpool losing 7-2 to Aston Villa. And what that highlighted was you can have frameworks, but the execution plan could be something very different and make things look very different. And that's where I want to start. We have to start at looking, what do we mean by a taxonomy? Well, the word taxonomy actually comes from from biology, and where we use it is for the naming of species. But when we talk about green, green is only one species, and it seems to be the case that what we tend to do is just say, here's a bunch of categorizations or classifications of different shades of green, and let's throw in something around social somewhere. But interestingly, when we heard the vice presidents and the governors speak, what we actually heard was something about a lady called Siti Juwita and her social issue. We talked about $2.5 trillion dollars per annum required to support the UN SDGs, of which largely are related to social issues and not just green or climate related. In fact, when we look at social issues when it comes to emerging markets, those are actually issues that resonate far more than necessarily the green issue. And we have to understand from an emerging markets point of view, there needs to be a massive recalibration on what I like to call developed market ideals when they come to meet developing market realities. So let's just focus on the green part of that sub-segment of sustainability. When we talk about that, we need to start to be really careful about what standards and credentials we use. Let's use a specific example. If we're talking about green standards that were developed in developed markets and you have asset managers who were headquartered in those developed markets, well, they're going to focus on that definition of green. Does that then crowd out local definition and investment into green companies or initiatives that actually progress transition? Are we going to have the survivors and the winners that are defined by one standard? And that has to be looked at very carefully, even if we say we need to focus on green beyond sustainability. And what does that mean for the private sector? Well, what it actually means is, where is the capital going to be directed? And if we do not specifically direct capital or indicate the specific funding gaps, what's going to happen? And we leave general categorizations and assume that that somehow works out what the correct categorization would be. Well, we might create asset bubbles. In fact, what we saw globally when it came to solar was that, which is a lot of money went into solar, but into some very unviable projects that couldn't really sustain debt financing. So that raises the next question beyond assets. It talks about the type of funding. Do we need equity, quasi-equity? Is that facilitated? And when we link that back to the funding point, well, how is all of that incentivized exactly? Because in order to move capital, and we have to understand most of that is private capital, it needs the right incentivization structure. Well, it's a question that nobody really wants to talk about. Finally, we need to also look at what we're facilitating. Indeed, developed markets have done a fantastic job in the capital markets. Well, what's the difference between financial and real economy? How are we making sure that SMEs that are innovating fantastic solutions for both social and environmental solutions, but also folks who are what we might say part of the problem that we need to help transition to be part of the solution? Well, what is the mix between the real economy, which is very much what value-based intermediation is about, that the governor referenced, and the financial economy? Are we patting ourselves on the back for the wrong things? And the last thing that seems to be something that's never really talked about is the other side of the balance sheet, as banks like to call it, which is, what about the liabilities? Yes, we talk about financing, but financing is funded by liquidity. So what about other forms of liquidity, liabilities on banks and, for example, other sources of liquidity? How are we going to enable that in terms of a classification and incentivization of the same to move more quickly into financing some of the solutions? So those would be my broad contrarian views to otherwise what I think are has been a good set of suggestions when it comes to moving ourselves from 10 years ago to today and talking about classification or taxonomies. Let me pass the question back to Farah on what do you think are the practical considerations emerging markets need to consider on adopting taxonomies that are different to developed markets?
Yes, certainly, Oz, I do agree with you on, in some areas, in the sense that we cannot just take a taxonomy that is developed by the developed markets and then impose that on developing economies and expect them to run with it. So the taxonomies that are developed for emerging markets have to be developed there and have to take their sustainable development goals, their agendas, their current economic development, and their environmental objectives in consideration when they are developing those considerations. And I agree with you that, for some of these borrowers like SMEs, for banks, having a very sort of granular, in the sense that it's supposed to help banks identify assets more easily. But when you think about it from the side of the borrower, as in the SME, who has to look at all of those the requirements that are there, for instance, the requirements to ensure that there's no cross-environmental risk, or cross social risks. I mean, for a very small cap company, this can be very expensive and very resource heavy. So we will have to figure out ways for them to be able to do this work. For instance, perhaps banks and financial institutions would just have to monitor those kinds of borrowers, specifically those borrowers who are working in high polluting industries, with working with heavy coal as fuel, or working with wastewater and other resources. It's obvious that the banks and the financial institutions will have to step up and monitor them more sort of closely, and apply the taxonomy. So yes, it's not going to be easy. But at the end of the day, this is the way that the world is moving, and it is ultimately going to make it easier for everyone to identify their assets, to understand what sort of activities are considered green and what are not green, and it will help them track the flows of those resources consistently across asset classes, across entities. So at the end of the day, it is going to be painful for emerging markets to begin with, but eventually I believe that they will get used to it. Let me ask Egul a question. Egul, I believe that the Kazakhstan taxonomy is based on the Mongolia taxonomy, that at least you use that as a blueprint. So we've been saying for a while now that countries should look at their own environmental objectives and their own context. So I was wondering how you managed to take the Mongolian taxonomy and make it your own.
All right, thank you for your question, Farah. Indeed, I want to support your earliest point regarding the development of taxonomy for emerging economies and for developed countries. We had this discussion earlier when we just started to work on development of taxonomy, and there were some experts saying that we should put some, the bars high, and get there. But at the same time, there were discussions that we believe that we should reflect the current economic development of the country in the taxonomy, and then to revise the taxonomy time to time, to have to change those indicators, those targets we want to reach depending on the current economic development. And I guess that's the right approach for us. And going back to the question regarding the taxonomy, the draft of the taxonomy based on the Mongolian experience, indeed, when we started to develop the taxonomy, we took the experience of Mongolia. But during the consultation process all this year, those indicators, those thresholds were processed by the industry experts, and of course they were fully changed to reflect those environmental objectives we have here in Kazakhstan. And if we go into some examples, for instance, if you may know, Kazakhstan is heavily relying on coal in its energy production, and for us it's one of the main issues to address in all those environmental objectives, and including reflect in the taxonomy. Therefore, we included the transition from coal to a more sustainable type of energy as a way to overcome in the taxonomy, and we'll also change those environmental those thresholds regarding the emission reduction. So I think each country, each government which will be developing its own taxonomy, as you already mentioned, actually, will adhere to its main environmental objectives set in strategic documents and try to reflect them in the taxonomy as an indicator, showing that the technology is green and the project is green. And in case of Kazakhstan, we have this concept of transition to a green economy adopted by the government around 7 years ago, and it reflects those main objectives for us. One of them is transition to renewable energy sources and reaching the 50% energy production by renewable energies by 2050. So we reflected that goal in the taxonomy, and we also have the goal of reduction of CO2 emissions comparing with the level of 1990, and that also was reflected in the taxonomy. And coming year, it's expected that the government will be adopting the new strategy of low carbon development for Kazakhstan. And it's expected that that strategy might reflect new new environmental goals for the country. And in that case, we expect that the taxonomy will be also reflecting that changes regarding the thresholds for the green projects. So I guess that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. And I actually received a related question in the chat box. The European Union has just released a green taxonomy. Why not simply use it for others? I'm sure that you can appreciate this answer. Basically, the EU green taxonomy can be a reference point, right? I mean, this taxonomy was developed by the European Commission as part of the EU Sustainable Action Plan, and it obviously supports the EU's very ambitious climate and energy targets, which are to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. Now, can other countries, other emerging market countries, obviously have different ambitions. Maybe they'll get there someday, but they're not there right now. So even if you look at the report published by the TEG, the Technical Expert Group, it says that the criteria defined by other countries, within quotes, will not be identical to the EU taxonomy and may vary depending on the specificities of the local market. And this is what I was trying to say, and I believe this is what you guys have also done. You took the Mongolia taxonomy, but then you made sure that it was fully aligned with your own regulations. So, I mean, what I'm trying to say here, that if a country were to emulate the EU taxonomy without considering the unique national circumstances, the sustainable development agendas, or the local priorities of these countries, then it may create confusion among users in the real sector. And it will contradict national priorities. So we have to be careful about these things.
Yeah, so Farah, just to chime in on that question, is that whole point around developed market ideals meeting developing market realities. So let's just use an example. This is not a part of the EU Green Taxonomy, but here's an example. There's something for buildings called the LEED standard, which is internationally recognized. In Malaysia, you have GBI, which is less, I think it's recognized in ASEAN.
Right.
Well, why don't we all just use LEED because that's international? Well, that's not actually practical because the GPI actually does represent a positive transition for an economy. Then we talk about developed versus developing markets. For generations, developed markets have had the access to a multitude of alternative sources, including nuclear, for example. Well, developing markets really haven't had that runway that developed markets have. So they're speaking from a different position altogether. So as a result, in order to have a balanced transition, then you could do it. Now, if the discussion is that developed markets who have benefited effectively from a number of years of economic development, that has come at the price of not pricing public goods. So we see post-industrial revolution GDP rocket like this. How did it rocket? Because we didn't price public goods. If those markets are therefore subsidizing and fully funding a higher standard for developing markets in a transfer, then that might be a different discussion. Given that that isn't happening really in any way that makes sense for local agendas and local priorities, I think that answers the question of why not only would it be suboptimal, it could be harmful for geographies to take such a step and have a broader impact in other areas, particularly societal.
Yes, and also, I mean, some of the minimum safeguards and the do no significant harm concept that has also been introduced in the EU taxonomy may not be suitable for emerging markets because they have not signed up to those treaties. So we have to be very, very careful when we say that we are going to import the EU taxonomy to developing countries. Now, there's a question here that says, shouldn't the taxonomy have a higher level of ambition vis-a-vis the national sustainability policies in order to act as an incentive to improve from the status quo? So the taxonomy is not a policy tool, right? So you have to change your policies. Of course, your ambition should be higher, and but that's a different thing. The taxonomy is not what is going to be used to change your policies. Your policies should change, and the taxonomy will follow suit. That's what I want to say.
Yeah, again, Farah, on that question, it becomes a point around ideals versus execution that's really important, and that gap has to be bridged. The issue on carbon, for example, is a global issue. The solutions are local. Malaysia is one of them, by the way, as well as Brazil and other places. Now, how exactly is that being incentivized for a global carbon issue that wasn't created by those countries? For example, I think Malaysia is like in the tiniest of percentages in terms of what it does in overall pollution when it comes to carbon, yet it has a significant potential to, well, for those who actually did pollute, it's one of those things. So we can turn around and start to give extremely lofty ideals for countries that haven't contributed to the situation but are a recipient of the harm, and we need to have open conversations about that. And taxonomies, even as guides, should take into consideration that, where we're looking at definitely positive and step up progress and transition, but in parameters that work for those geographies.
I totally agree. Of course, we also know that climate change will not know any boundaries or any walls or any borders, so it'll affect everyone. But having said that, I was just thinking about the small island countries, Mauritius, for instance, whose contribution to greenhouse gases is like 0.01%. And they are pledging in their NDC that they're in their portfolio, in their energy mix, they're going to move 30% to renewable energy, and that they are going to divert resources towards that. Now, here is a country that contributes very, very little to the problem, and yet it has other very big problems of its own. It's highly vulnerable to natural disasters. So it should actually be focusing on climate change adaptation. So what should it do? Should it be diverting much scarce resources to adaptation or to mitigation? So those are the kind of things that countries need to consider when they are developing their taxonomies. Egil, it looks like I've got a question for you. It is, how much time did it take for Kazakhstan to develop its taxonomy?
Well, I think it was more than 1 year, because we had the initial discussion last year, sometimes I think like sometimes in summer, but then like the official start of the work was early this year, although there was some development of around the draft, but then like officially it started sometimes early this year. But then it's also important to mention that the work is not like fully finalized yet, because we have the final draft, but right now it's being considered by the Ministry of Environment, and we expect it to be adopted on the nationwide level right after the environmental code. So just to explain the situation here, the environmental code is the main legislation for such issues here in Kazakhstan, and we included the definitions of green finance, taxonomy, green loans, and green bonds in the environmental code. And we expect the code to be adopted sometimes later this year, latest in December. And right after that, within 2-3 months, we expect those legislations which will be supporting those initiatives in the environmental code to be adopted. So that also includes the taxonomy, and we're also introducing some incentives for project holders to cover the expenses, to cover the interest rates for green loans and the coupon payment for green bonds. So those initiatives, they will be adopted as separate legislation right after the adoption of environmental code within like 2-3 months.
Okay, that's very interesting. And Malaysia also, for its SRI sukuk, has some similar incentives to not reduce the interest rate, but I believe to pay for the external review for green and social sukuk, for SRI sukuk. So what are the main challenges that you faced in developing the taxonomy?
Well, I guess it's a difference of mindset of people, because there were a lot of people involved in the process, including the government officials, including the representatives of industries, financial sector, and like everyone wants to have a taxonomy to be developed in its own favor, right? And also there were some industrial experts involved in the coal production, let's say, and they wanted to include the coal in a taxonomy, so there were like certain issues like this. And it's also quite difficult in terms of adoption of the taxonomy, because there were certain discussions on which level the taxonomy should be adopted. Initially, we're expecting it to be adopted on our stock exchange, so to be adopted by the stock exchange. But then we came up with the idea that it should be nationwide in order to be used by all the stakeholders, including the project developers, financial sector, the academia, and all those who can be interested in this. So we came up with this, and we're expecting the Ministry of Environment to push this agenda. But at the same time, there is not much interest from the central bank still, and we hope that that it will join later. So I believe like the main issue is, to get all those stakeholders to be involved in the process, and like, provide its own input for the best result.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it is time consuming. As I said, it's resource heavy, lots of consultations, coordinating with different ministries of the government. So it is an intense process. And I believe that even the technical expert group's recommendations for the EU took about 2 years. It was 2 years in the making. So you just have to accept that this is not something that can be done very, very quickly. There's a question from the audience. How should governments address potential social issues such as loss of jobs due to the potential close down of non-environment friendly sectors arising from low financing supports from the financial markets. So yes, I mean, these are things that need to be considered when developing taxonomies. I already mentioned how you have to be careful about mitigating, identifying the risks from these projects. So we already talked about the European Union equivalent of that in the EU taxonomy, which is the do no significant harm concept. What we are saying in the taxonomy guide is that countries should rely on national policies for environmental and social risk identification and assessment, and then look at mitigation potential and opportunities for mitigation of risks like that. That is going to be certainly very, very important, because the last thing that you want to do is that, you know, while you are trying to do something positive for the environment, you end up doing something negative for the community. So those are things that you would certainly have to balance.
Yeah, I would just add here for that regarding this question, that when the governments are developing the taxonomy, they should always take into account the current economic development of the country. Therefore, the transition should be smooth. That's why it's not necessary to include, you know, those like very strict bars, like very high bars in the taxonomy right away. They should be introduced like, you know, smoothly. Once there is a, you know, change in those indicators, there should be given some time, you know, for the economy to adapt to that. So like those players who are not in those sectors could get some time to learn something new, you know, to switch their economic activities. And it should be done like, you know, in timely manner.
Okay. Thank you, Egul. And then another question is, can a green taxonomy help identify climate risks? So I'll take that question if you don't mind. Well, you know, a green taxonomy is really used to determine the eligibility of positive actions, right? It's a positive list. So in general, a green taxonomy is not meant for identifying climate risks. If you really want to identify your exposure to climate risks, then you should look at a brown taxonomy rather than a green taxonomy. So which can provide sort of more information on investments that may introduce climate-related financial risks in a portfolio. I know, also you've spoken a little bit about that, but can I ask you what you think would be the impact of banks in Malaysia if a taxonomy, if they had to align their portfolio to a taxonomy? I mean, at the working level, what impact do you see?
Yeah, so I mean, the question about risk management is one where you look at physical, transition, or liability risks, right? So that's what you look at. What are my physical risks? What are my transition risks? And what are my legal liability risks when it comes to any particularly when we're now talking about climate change. The practical implication is really clear that there's a difference between what a taxonomy is and what risk appetite is, and that was the point around one, identifying what funding gaps are to achieve a target, but then what type of funding, whether that's equity and debt and so on and so forth. If people kind of rally straight into saying, well, we're going to put more capital against this particular thing, you may create a bubble, and we've seen that, right? That doesn't help. So the overhang of the bubble from too much money going into solar and many banks getting potentially impacted because the projects were not viable, that has significance for risk appetite to the sector. So people have got to be careful. And again, it's that whole point around frameworks are great, but execution plans are much better, right? So so I think that when we look at what banks will do, we have to understand that taxonomies, particularly when regulated, do have an influence on a bank, and what influence is it having on the bank is very important to understand. It being something practical is very important to understand, and I think that in terms of having incentives is very important. So whether that's on a regulatory capital point of view or other relief, whether that's direct incentives on taxation, that certainly helps mobilize capital in the right way, but that has to be done in the context of making sure that because you asked the question specifically around banks, maintaining banks' financial stability. So it's not just about finding the right causes to finance, it's about financing the right things and keeping depositors safe at the same time. So, if it's done badly, could have a bad outcome. If it's done well, it will proof on, particularly around managing transition risk and potential physical risk as well.
Thank you, Oz. Now, one last question is about whether Sharia principles and Sharia scholars should be part of this development process so as to avoid Sharia compliant risk in the future. I believe that yes, it should. If we're talking about a country like Malaysia, where Islamic finance is prevalent, then certainly it should be a consideration. But perhaps, Oz, you can answer this question better.
So value-based intermediation is based off of Sharia principles. So before, even before we talk about green and the sustainable development goals, was a popular thing in 2015. 1400 years ago, there was already a framework that looked at that. I'll give you an example, just a very simple example. In Islamic finance, there's an exclusion list for sectors that you can't finance. Guess what? When you overlay that with the exclusion list that came up in 2015, 1400 years kind of later, of the United Nations Sustainable Development, guess what? There's a huge overlap. Yes. Which is fascinating. So I think that Islamic principles have something to give, even more so in this current time. And also, I believe that if a proper analysis is done and research is done, there's places to enhance some of the objectives that we're trying to achieve through sustainability, through looking at things from a kind of a lens of Islamic canon law, and the way certain groups should be treated, and including in those groups is the planet that we're supposed to be looking after. Now, when we talk about the inclusion of Sharia scholars in that, I think what we need the inclusion of are scholars, period, who can continue to inform the people and actors and actresses that are looking at this agenda. And of course, they would naturally be there. And I think an area of focus could actually be, if we were to take the 250 odd objectives of the 17 UN SDGs and looked at them from a lens of a Sharia angle, where would there be enhancements that were informed from Sharia to those? I think that would be very interesting, and an interesting area for Sharia scholars to, look and research with the folks that they normally work with. But more generally, when we talk about this agenda, whether Sharia scholars or scholars of a different ilk should always certainly be part of these discussions.
I agree, Oz. Well, we are running out of time, so let me thank Oz and Egol for joining me in this panel discussion. This was a really interesting discussion, and I'm sure we could talk forever. And I hope that when circumstances are much better, we can actually meet in person and discuss this at length even more. But for now, let me just thank you and hand over to Rosani.
Everyone, could you please have a look at the poll on the chat box and just answer 3 questions, please? That will help us improve our programming in the future. And at the same time, there's also going to be a survey, and I appreciate if you could answer the survey as well. That would help us prepare for our next event as well. In the meantime, I would like to say thank you very much to our panelists and our speaker, Farah, Aigul, and Oz. We really appreciate your insightful comments and your thoughts and your opinions today. Thank you very much.